fields of northeastern France were painted in colors that no artist could ever truly capture. The wheat swayed like a golden ocean, the poppies dotted the landscape like drops of blood on a green canvas, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and wildflowers. It was a land that had known peace for generations, a land where farmers worked the soil with the same hands their fathers had used and their fathers before them. Édouard Moreau was born into this world. He was the youngest of 4 children, raised in a small stone farmhouse that had stood for over 200 years. His family had tilled the same fields since the time of Napoleon. They knew every contour of the land, every stream, every tree that provided shade during the hot summer afternoons. They knew the language of the earth better than they knew the language of men. From the age of 6, Édouard worked alongside his father. He learned to plant wheat, to harvest barley, to tend to the cows that provided milk for the family. He learned to read the sky, to predict the weather, to know when the rains would come and when the frost would arrive. He developed a patience that seemed unnatural for a boy his age. He could sit for hours, watching a single bird, studying its movements, understanding its world. He was a boy who observed, who listened, who absorbed the world around him without needing to speak. His mother would often say that Édouard was born with an old soul. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. While other boys his age dreamed of adventure and faraway places, Édouard dreamed of the harvest. He dreamed of the day he would inherit the farm, of the wife he would marry, of the children who would run through the same fields he had played in as a boy. His world was small, but it was complete. It was enough. Marie Delacroix lived on the neighboring farm. Her family had known the Moreaus for 3 generations. She and Édouard had grown up together, played together as children, and as they grew older, their friendship had blossomed into something deeper. By the time Édouard was 18, he knew that he would marry Marie. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a hope, it was a certainty, as certain as the changing of the seasons. In the summer of 1914, Édouard was 20 years old. He was strong from years of labor, his hands calloused and tough, his shoulders broad from carrying sacks of grain. He was not handsome in the traditional sense, but there was a kindness in his eyes, a gentleness in his manner that drew people to him. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who observed more than he judged, who understood more than he revealed. Marie was 19. She had a laugh that could fill a room, a spirit that was as bright as the summer sun. She was practical and hard-working, but she also had a romantic soul. She dreamed of a life with Édouard, of a home filled with children and laughter, of growing old together, their hands gnarled but still holding each other. On the 1st of August, 1914, Édouard and Marie walked through the fields together. It was a perfect summer evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They walked in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing against each other. They stopped by an old oak tree that had stood on the property for centuries. Under its branches, Édouard took Marie's hands and looked into her eyes. "Marie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a home with you. I want to fill our farm with children. I want to grow old with you, and I want to die in your arms, knowing that I was the luckiest man who ever lived." Marie's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. She threw her arms around him, and they held each other under the ancient oak, the world around them perfect and complete. But even as they embraced, the world was changing. Far away in the halls of power, the great nations of Europe were sharpening their knives. On the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. It was a political act, a decision made by men in suits who had never worked a day in their lives. But it set in motion a chain of events that would change the world forever. Alliances were activated, promises were made, and one by one, the great powers of Europe began to march. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France. and on the 4th of August, Germany invaded Belgium, bringing Britain into the conflict. Édouard was in the fields when he heard the news. His father had ridden into the village to buy supplies, and he returned with a face as pale as ash. "War," his father said simply. "France is at war." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Édouard knew what this meant. He was a man of fighting age. He would be called to serve the farm, the fields, the future he had dreamed of with Marie. All of it was suddenly threatened. But he didn't panic. He didn't rage against the injustice. He simply nodded and continued working. There was no point in worrying about what was to come. The only thing he could control was the work in front of him. So he worked. He harvested the crops. He prepared the fields for winter. He did everything he could to ensure that his family would survive, even if he wasn't there to help them. The call came in early September. Édouard was ordered to report to the local barracks. He would be enlisted in the French army and sent to the front. On the morning of his departure, the entire family gathered outside the farmhouse. His mother wept silently, holding his face in her hands. His father shook his hand, a firm grip that conveyed 1,000 words without speaking a single one. His siblings hugged him, promising to write, promising to keep the farm running. And then there was Marie. She stood apart from the others, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She was holding a small package wrapped in cloth. When she approached him, she pressed it into his hands. "Open it later," she whispered, "when you need to remember me." He knew he couldn't cry. He had to be strong. But when he looked into her eyes, he felt a pain in his chest that was worse than any wound he could imagine. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. "I will come back," he whispered. "I promise. I will come back, and I will marry you, and we will have the life we dreamed of." She nodded, unable to speak. He turned away from her, unable to bear the look in her eyes. He walked down the road, his wooden clogs heavy on the cobblestones. He didn't look back. He knew that if he did, he would never be able to leave. The journey to the front was long and exhausting. Édouard and the other recruits were packed into train cars, so crowded that they could barely move. They traveled for days, stopping and starting, the train carrying them deeper into the unknown. Édouard quickly learned that the army was not the orderly institution he had imagined. It was chaos. Nobody knew anything. Orders were given and countermanded. The food was terrible. The conditions were miserable. And yet, through it all, the men found ways to laugh, to joke, to find meaning in the madness. Édouard made friends during those long days. There was Jean, a baker from Paris who had never held a weapon in his life. There was André, a teacher from a small village who saw the war as a great adventure. There was Michel, a poet who kept a notebook in his pocket and wrote verses about the horrors he witnessed. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about their families, their dreams, the women they had left behind. They talked about food, the memories of home-cooked meals that had never seemed so precious. They talked about the war, speculating on when it would end, how it would end, whether they would survive. But deep down, Édouard knew the truth. This war would not end quickly. It would not end easily. It would devour everything in its path. And the only question was whether any of them would be left standing when it was over. The train finally stopped near a small town called Verdun. Édouard had never heard of it. But he would soon learn that the name Verdun would become etched into his soul, a scar that would never fully heal. The Battle of Verdun began on the 21st of February, 1916. It was the brainchild of General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German Chief of Staff. Falkenhayn was a cold, calculating man. He understood that the French were deeply attached to Verdun, both strategically and emotionally. He knew that if he attacked Verdun, the French would be forced to defend it at all costs, and he knew that in doing so, they would bleed themselves white. Falkenhayn called it Operation Gericht, Operation Judgment. It was not a battle meant to win territory. It was a battle meant to destroy an army, to break a nation's will, to kill so many men that the French would be forced to surrender. And so, on that cold February morning, the German artillery opened fire. 1 million shells rained down on the French positions around Verdun, turning the landscape into a nightmare of mud, blood, and fire. The bombardment lasted for 10 hours. 10 hours of continuous, unrelenting artillery fire. The sound was deafening. The ground shook. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the attack. Édouard and his unit were stationed in the trenches waiting. They had been told that the Germans were coming, that the attack was imminent. They had been told to hold their positions no matter what. They had been told that the fate of France rested on their shoulders. And so they waited. They crouched in the muddy trenches, their rifles held tight, their eyes scanning the smoke-filled horizon. They tried to make themselves small, tried to hide from the shells that seemed to fall with deadly precision. But there was nowhere to hide. There was nothing to do but wait and pray and hope that they would survive. When the infantry attack finally came, it was terrifying. The German soldiers advanced in waves, their grey uniforms blending with the smoke and the mud. They were relentless. They didn't stop. They didn't retreat. They just kept coming, wave after wave, their faces grim and determined. Édouard fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He fired his rifle until the barrel was too hot to touch. He fixed his bayonet and charged when he was ordered to charge. He saw men fall on both sides, their bodies crumpling to the ground, their blood soaking into the mud. He saw his friend Jean take a bullet to the chest, his eyes going wide with surprise before he collapsed. He didn't have time to mourn. There was no time for grief in the madness of Verdun. There was only the next attack, the next order, the next moment of survival. For months, the battle raged. It was not a battle of movement. It was a battle of attrition. Both sides were locked in a deadly struggle, each determined to break the other. The landscape around Verdun became a wasteland. The forests were reduced to splinters. The villages were turned to rubble. The very earth was churned into a soup of mud and bone. Édouard and his fellow soldiers endured it all. They endured the rain, the cold, the constant fear of death. They endured the rats that fed on the dead, the lice that infested their clothing, the stench of rotting flesh that permeated everything. They endured the knowledge that each day might be their last. As the battle dragged on, Édouard was given a new assignment. He was to be a listener. The French army had developed a technique called sounding. Experienced soldiers would listen to the sounds of German mining operations. They would press a stethoscope-like device called a geophone against the earth and listen for the telltale sounds of the enemy digging tunnels. If they heard German miners approaching, they could warn their own engineers to countermine, or they could evacuate the soldiers above. Édouard was chosen for this assignment because of his patience, his ability to sit in silence for hours, his uncanny ability to perceive the subtlest changes in his environment. The farmer's son, who had spent years listening to the earth, was now using those same skills to save lives. His listening post was a small dugout, barely large enough for one man. It was located deep underground, in a network of tunnels that ran beneath the trenches. The only light came from a small candle, which he was allowed to burn for a few hours each night. The rest of the time he sat in absolute darkness, the geophone pressed to his ear, listening. And he heard things, terrible things. He heard the Germans digging, their shovels scraping against the rock, their voices muffled by the earth. He heard the booby traps exploding, the tunnels collapsing, the muffled screams of men buried alive. He heard the whispers of the dead, the echoes of their last moments, the silence that followed when they were gone. But he also heard the sounds of the living. He heard the miners singing, the soldiers laughing, the chaplains praying. He heard the drip of water, the scurry of rats, the distant rumble of artillery. He heard the sounds of humanity holding on, even in the face of unspeakable horror. For weeks, Édouard sat in that dugout, listening. He became a ghost, a silent presence that existed only in the darkness. He spoke to no one. He rarely saw the sun. He existed in a world of sound, a world of vibration, a world of shadows. But the isolation took its toll. He began to lose track of time. He began to forget what day it was, what month it was. He began to lose his sense of self, his connection to the world above. The only thing that kept him grounded was the photograph of Marie, the memory of her face, the promise he had made to return to her. One night, Édouard heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound he had heard before, but never this close. It was the sound of German miners. They were digging directly underneath his position. They were so close that he could hear their voices, their laughter, their commands. They were digging a tunnel, and they were going to pack it with explosives. Édouard reported what he had heard. He sent a message up the chain of command, warning his superiors that the Germans were about to blow up their position, but there was no time to evacuate. The Germans were too close. The attack was imminent, and then the world exploded. The blast was deafening. It threw Édouard against the wall of his dugout, knocking the breath out of him. The tunnel collapsed around him, burying him in rubble. He was trapped, alone, in the darkness. Hours passed, days, he couldn't tell. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain in his leg excruciating. He knew it was broken, he knew he was bleeding, he knew he was going to die. And yet he didn't panic, he didn't scream, he didn't rage against the injustice. He simply sat in the darkness and listened. He listened to the sounds of the earth above him, the muffled footsteps of soldiers, the distant rumble of artillery. He listened to his own heartbeat, growing weaker, slower. He listened to the silence that was slowly enveloping him. And in that silence, he heard something else. A voice, a familiar voice. It was Marie. She was speaking to him, though he knew she wasn't really there. She was in his mind, a creation of his fevered imagination, but her voice was so clear, so comforting. "Édouard," she said. "Édouard, wake up. You can't die here. You have to wake up. You have to come home." He tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. He could only lie in the darkness and listen. And then he heard another sound, the sound of shovels. French shovels. They were digging him out. They found him just in time. His leg was broken. He had lost a lot of blood, but he was alive. He was carried to a field hospital where he spent weeks recovering. The doctors told him that he was lucky. They told him that he would survive. They told him that he would walk again. But they were wrong about one thing. They said he would be able to move on, to forget what he had seen, to rebuild his life. They didn't understand that some scars never heal. When Édouard returned to the front, the Battle of Verdun was still raging. But he was no longer a soldier, he was something else, something darker. He had seen too much, he had heard too much. He had been too close to death, too intimate with the horrors of war. The man who had left the farm was gone. The man who returned was a ghost, a shadow, a shell of his former self. He fought for the rest of the war. Not with courage, but with survival. He didn't believe in the cause anymore. He didn't believe in anything. He just wanted to make it to the end, to see the sun rise on a world that had somehow survived. And then, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The Great War was over. Édouard returned to the farm in the spring of 1919. The land was still scarred, the fields still torn by shell craters. But the poppies were blooming again, and the wheat was starting to grow. The earth, as always, was healing. Marie was waiting for him. She had waited for 4 long years, never giving up hope, never believing that he was gone. She had written to him every week, hundreds of letters that he had never received. She had prayed for him every night. She had kept their love alive, even when everything else seemed lost. When she saw him coming down the road, her heart broke. The man who approached was not the man she had said goodbye to. He was thinner, older, haunted. His eyes were hollow, his face pale, his steps uncertain. But she didn't hesitate. She ran to him, threw her arms around him and held him as tightly as she could. She felt the tears on her cheeks. the sobs that shook her body. "Edward," she whispered, "you came back. You came back to me." He nodded, unable to speak. He held her in his arms, feeling her warmth, her love, her hope. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be whole again. Édouard did marry Marie. They had children, 3 of them, who grew up on the farm that had been in his family for generations. He taught them how to work the land, how to listen to the earth, how to respect the rhythms of nature. But he never fully recovered from the war. He carried the scars inside him, hidden from everyone, even Marie. He would sometimes wake in the night, drenched in sweat, his hands shaking, his eyes wild. He would sometimes sit for hours, staring at nothing, lost in memories that he could never share. He became known as the Silent Watcher. He was the man who listened more than he spoke, who observed more than he judged, who understood more than he revealed. He was kind, generous, and deeply loved, but there was a part of him that was forever lost, a part of him that would never come back from the war. In the summer of 1956, Édouard died peacefully in his sleep. He was 62 years old. His funeral was attended by the entire village, all of whom had been touched by his quiet kindness. Marie outlived him by 15 years. She never remarried. She spent her final years tending to the farm, writing letters to her children, and remembering the boy she had loved under the ancient oak tree. When she died, her children found a small package hidden in her belongings. Inside was the photograph of Édouard, the one he had carried with him through the war. It was faded and worn, but the face was still visible. And on the back, in Marie's handwriting, were the words, "The love of my life, the silent watcher, the man who came home." The Battle of Verdun is remembered as one of the most horrific battles in human history. Over 300,000 men died in those 10 months of hell. Thousands more were wounded, scarred for life, their bodies and minds broken beyond repair. But Édouard was one of the survivors. He was one of the few who made it through, who came home, who rebuilt his life. He was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the strength that lies within each of us, the hope that refuses to die. His story is not unique. There were millions like him, millions of men who endured unspeakable horrors and somehow found the strength to go on. They did not seek fame, they did not seek glory. They simply did what they had to do, and when it was over, they returned to their lives, carrying the weight of their memories. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, remember Édouard. Remember the boy who loved the earth. Remember the soldier who listened in the darkness. Remember the father who taught his children to be kind. Remember the silent watcher who came home. And remember that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. There is always love. There is always a reason to keep going. Rest now. The war is over. The watch is over. You are safe. May you sleep peacefully, surrounded by the love of those who care for you. And may the whispers of the past never disturb your dreams. Good night.